Hey everybody, it's Chris and Rick Talk Guitars again. We're back on the horse. Chris and I are back, hopefully, in a regular cadence. We're going to do this. But anyway, the thing he and I were talking about recently were guitar trends. He and I have seen so many trends since we started playing guitar, and I'm sure there were trends going on before that, and they will continue. But when he brought that up to me, I mean, things that came to my mind were, I remember when I was starting out playing guitar, basically there were just stock guitars. You'd buy a used Fender or Gibson or whatever, and it was stock. But then this trend started happening where people were making different pickups, and maybe you wanted a humbucker that would convert to a single coil. Remember that? Like, and you'd get, and I remember seeing these pictures of these guitars with little switches on them and little things, and it's like, oh boy. And then also there was a company called Warmoth that created all these guitar parts, and you could create, your own Strat to your own configuration, right? So you could buy this rosewood neck, and you could buy a body that took humbuckers or a combination of humbuckers and single coils. And so it's just kind of interesting to think about kind of, the evolution of that whole thing. What are some things that stick out in your brain when you think back to kind of the onset of maybe some trends, and maybe not, maybe I'm just focusing on mods and things like that, but what other trends can you think of that kind of strike you when you were coming up? Can you hear me?
Yeah, did you hear that? It sounded like a plane was going to crash.
No.
Yeah, the modification was definitely a trend that was definitely in its infancy when I started. I think just as guitar players, just human nature to want to tinker with stuff.
Yeah.
But it's funny that you mentioned Warmoth as far as like guitar modification parts sources, because I never heard of them. And so they're regional. They're like in Puyallup.
I think so. Yeah. Yeah.
So, I mean, for me, the first one that I was aware of was a company called Mighty Mite that sold pickups and necks and things like that. And that was like one of the only games in town. And then, I mean, Schecter came out like in the early to mid 80s, I think.
Oh,
I remember that. But yeah, my source for guitar trends where I kind of like constantly think about things is I have like about maybe 60 or 70 old 70s and 80s guitar player magazines that I like to rifle through. And there's, that is like a great window into trends throughout the years, and, interviews with guitar players, famous guitar players, and what they're into and what their thinking is. And it's really, really interesting over time to see all of those things, like what is in fashion and, people's takes on things. So that's kind of what I drew from. And yeah, I remember when the modification thing hit, I remember looking at Mighty Mite pickups. I had like an Epiphone, a Japanese Epiphone guitar, and I was thinking maybe I could get a humbucker in this. I didn't do it, but I just like it was an option back then. So yeah, tinkering with your guitar is kind of like, I wouldn't even consider it a trend. It's just like a thing that, is like still going on today. I mean, it's a big part of guitar culture now. It's like you get a guitar and the first thing you do is like, what pickups am I going to put in it? Yeah. You know what I mean? So that's held pretty fast, but it's amazing how many more options we have now than back then.
I mean? Well, and totally. And I totally see the value in, like, I'm thinking of too, maybe a guitar player that couldn't afford like several guitars and says, well, I want some versatility in my sound, but I don't want to buy like a Les Paul and a Strat and a Tele. So, I'm going to have this push-pull pot put in my guitar so that my humbucker can change into a single coil. And I totally dig that. I mean, because, for some musicians, you can't afford a golf bag full of guitars.
Right.
Yeah.
And that you'll see in interviews. Preamps, onboard preamps were huge, like in the 70s, like the mid to late 70s. Everybody started doing that. And I think my personal take on it is, yes, I think we were always, as guitar consumers, we were sold this idea that you need versatility. Like versatility doesn't come out, and like all the ads copy and everything points to that, a million sounds in this one guitar or this one amp. And I think that's bullshit. You know what I mean? Yeah. I think a good sound will go a long ways. You know what I mean? I think like an audience member will much more appreciate if you play like your whole cover version songs like with a really good tone that maybe
Yeah.
you vary just a little bit, then like having like a push button, like, look, I'm Mark Knopfler now. Look, I'm Stevie Ray Vaughan. Look, it's just that's my take, anyways. But I think a lot of these trends that we're going to be talking about, I think a lot of it is market driven. And I think as guitar players, we're kind of like sold these ideas that we kind of subscribe to. And some of them are based on, truth. And face it, we love to waste time and we love to spend money. I mean, I include myself in that. It's just what you do as a guitar player. And in order to be a successful guitar player, you have to find a balance between that, between completely wasting your fucking time and actually playing the guitar and getting good at the guitar, because there's so many options for wasting your time. And this is as old as the guitar itself, I kind of think. But
yeah, I think that's a good
weed a little bit.
No. I think that's a good point. That I think I think a good portion of it is market driven, right? Exactly. For people who want to sell shit. And I think to your point too, it's like, I don't think I spent enough time ever just thinking about the versatility I could get out of a guitar without modding, right? Using volume or using my fingers, or, you know what I mean? Using things that are at your disposal already with the guitar and the amp, rather than having some other additional stuff put on to your guitar, like a changing your humbucker from a humbucker to a single coil. That's a good point. And I think a lot of that shit is driven by the market. People want to sell shit, right? They want to sell all this stuff. And even I remember local music stores would love to do mods because it meant that they could charge you, sure, I'll do that for you because we can charge you money and we can sell you this shit. So I think both things can be true. I think there are people that wanted that versatility in terms of, okay, I want a Strat and a humbucker, and I'm gonna, I can have the best of both worlds, quote, in one guitar. And then I think there was this whole drive from a marketing standpoint and sales standpoint of like, hey, we got this stuff and we want to sell it to musicians. I think you raise a good point. Yeah. So, I mean, like in terms of mods and stuff, I remember too, when the Floyd Rose hit too, that was supposed to be the paradigm shift of whammy bars. It won't go out of tune, blah, blah, blah. And people were routing out these vintage guitars now that are vintage, and
right,
putting these goddamn and putting holes in their neck up by the nut and shit. And even back then, I was dubious about that shit. It's like, God, that seems like a pretty invasive thing to do to a guitar, just to have. And, come to find out, if you just put graphite in your nut and you set up your guitar right, a regular whammy setup will serve you well, as
I'm gonna play devil's advocate just for a moment and say, even though it's like not my thing at all, I kind of would argue that the Floyd Rose was kind of like a pretty incredible invention. And sure, you can do all those things, and it's the way you or I would approach that. But it like totally like changed the way that sort of like style of playing. I mean, it was huge. Not my thing, but I mean, as far as like dive bombs and pulling up and all this stuff, it was a pretty revolutionary development for guitar. Again, I'm not for like routing out a Les Paul or something like that. It's like, get a guitar that has that on there.
Yeah.
But that was pretty. I mean, it's still pretty. I think it's pretty popular today. I'm sure
it is, and it's become stock gear, like on right. Maybe Jacksons and shit. Like no, and I didn't mean. I
wasn't saying that.
Yeah, but I think you're right. I mean, it was a game changer in terms of that sucker would not go out of tune. I mean, because everything was bolted down, which is cool. But for me, exactly, like even back then, I'm like, that seems like a pretty invasive thing to do to get that technology on your guitar. And then as I got older too, I mean, I started to read more about like guys that just used stock Fender trems or think shit like that, or even Eddie Van Halen when he started out. There were little tricks he did. Granted, there were tricks you had to apply, but they were still. They would make the whammy stuff you had work better than you thought they would work. But you're right. I mean, there's no question about it. The Floyd was a game changer. I mean, it was a fucking game changer. I remember I have this vivid memory of this kid who had a 70s Explorer and he put one on that sucker. Ouch. And I played the fuck out of that thing. And it was like, yep, I could stand on this thing and it will not go out of tune. It's like, and it was impressive. But again, like, it's like, okay, you can put this on your fucking guitar, but you got to route out the guitar. And then not only that, you got to drill holes in the neck up where the nut is, so you can put on that hardware and shit. So yeah, but like you say too, now it's evolved where it's like, probably, these guitar manufacturers have partnerships with Floyd Rose where, that just comes stock on their guitars. So it's all part of the package. But that was definitely a trend. I mean, I remember that it was a sea change in whammy bar stuff. It was like, fuck this. Yeah, it was crazy.
And you see it today with like guitars where people are struggling with, what do I do with this now? I mean, it's a vintage guitar and it's great. It's like, now I got to fill these holes and
I know
all this stuff.
And go ahead.
No, I forgot what I was going to say.
Well, and that's another thing to think about too, is like back when you and I were playing, when, we always harken back to our younger days because we're old, but, Fenders and Gibsons were just used guitars. I mean, there was kind of there were people who thought of these guitars more fondly but there wasn't a real vintage market per se. There just wasn't, that didn't happen till later. So when you and I were looking at guitars and shit that were used, it's like, oh yeah, that's a Les Paul. It's a used guitar. It's a used guitar. It's cool, but it's just a used guitar. And so I think people obviously back then they were more okay with like routing it out or putting shit on it, but even big players would do that too. Like, Jerry Garcia and all these guys would trick out their guitars that were, 60s and 50s guitars that now, exactly, hindsight, it's like, fuck, this thing's routed out and shit.
And the other thing to think about in trends is how much things like neck profile and guitar weight has changed, because I have actually read interviews with somebody, and I wish I need to get Post-its to bookmark some of this stuff. But someone was talking about an old Gibson, maybe it was a Les Paul or something, who said it was really light, but it still sustained. So it was like that whole reverse thinking, like, heavy guitars sustain more than light guitars.
Yeah.
How many, classic players of 70s, 60s, and 70s rocks had their necks shaved to be thinner. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Thin necks were definitely in. And I remember struggling with my first, cheap copy guitars and kind of the clubby, like not very good feeling necks. And the first time picking up like a Les Paul or, a Fender or something like that, and like feeling that thin kind of like taper and that really heavy guitar. It's like, this is a good guitar. It's heavy and it's got a thin neck, and that was kind of what the yardstick of measuring was. It's like, because again, we were told heavy guitars sustain more than light guitars. And it's just, and that totally flipped. And I think that was a trend. And I think, some of these things we're talking about are definitely like just kind of went from trend to just like, they just worked their way in, and it's just what it is, like the Floyd Rose and things like that. But I'm often wonder, is like, will skinny necks ever be in again? They were huge. They were a selling point of a guitar, thin profile, super fast neck. So that's something I don't know if we'll ever return to. Heavy guitars, I think that's just the thing. I don't think anyone's ever going to want a heavy guitar. You know what I mean?
Well, I think neck profiles though now have become a thing, like you're saying. Back when guitars were being made, there were, people didn't think about, oh, well, there are people with small hands, big hands, blah, blah, blah. But like you say, so now I wouldn't say like thin necks are in or out. Thin necks now are just a part of the spectrum of neck profiles you can get as a guitar player, right? It's
right.
Like my Les Paul is a classic, like a 60 reissue, and the 60 neck was that shaved, thinner neck profile, which I totally dig too, because I've got small hands. But when you're talking about that, it made me think too about, there was a huge trend for guitars to strip their finish off their guitars. John Lennon, Ronson, all these guys, strip because they were told that it would give the guitar better tone, or take the pickup covers off even too, right? Because that would give your pickups a different sound. I don't even know how much of that is true, but that was a huge trend, because if you look at some of those 70s players and 60s players, that they've stripped the finish off of this 60 something.
Little tone chasing things like that. I guess it's been ongoing.
Yeah.
It's not as bad as it is today. Like as far as like looking for the magic thing that gives you that extra bit of tone.
Yeah.
Like we're guitar players. That stuff is like in our DNA. like, what can I do to get that, find the magic tone? Which,
Well, and I think it's and it, like you and I have talked about before. A lot of times I think it's deceiving because it's like, for me, a lot of the guitar players that I love their early initial tone that they had, and you're right. I mean, it's just kind of I don't even think it's guitar endemic to guitar players. I think it's just there's this curiosity and this we have a desire to tinker and tweak and seek things, whether it's like, if you're a car nut or whatever, you're always seeking to tweak it, but for us musicians, yeah, we're chasing this sound in our head or comparing it to what we did before. But a lot of times it's like it will lead. I know for me personally, I went on a goose chase and bought a bunch of gear that was just, it was okay, but probably some of the best sounds I got were from that Marshall half stack and that 80 V I had back in the early days.
I think part of it, this is my theory anyway, is I think the person who gets something and sticks with it and learns how to use it is way better off than the person that has the UPS truck showing up every day with something else new. Because your shit doesn't sound great every night. It doesn't sound good. Sometimes it's like, whoa. And if you go changing it instead of learning to use what you have, it's like, oh, wow, this amp sounds a little bit cold or harsh tonight. The amp well enough to say, well, if I just back the mid down a little bit, or whatever you need to do, it. You're so familiar with it. And I think all those guitar players you mentioned, they were poor and they just got their sound and they knew it inside out. And it's like once you go on that wild goose chase, it's just like, one night, I mean, it's fleeting. Good tone is fleeting. And a lot of times when you think it doesn't sound very good, it does sound very good. Yeah. I mean, it's like bring it, whatever you can do to bring it back to the way you're playing. I mean, it's going to come down to the way you play. Chasing things around or thinking like caps or something like that is going to, kind of make or break your sound. It's just like, it seems like a fool's errand to me. I mean, I've learned, I went through all that. I'm like anybody else. I went through all that shit. I tried all these things and I'm curious and I like it and I'm glad I did, but I'm still playing the same rig I was playing in 1996. It works. It just works.
I think that's exactly right. And I think a lot of times we just have to go on these trips anyway. My hope is that most people learn or like what you said, it's like, well, shit, why don't I just get some good basic ingredients and really, really get familiar with it? Because I'm guilty of that. I mean, I had great stuff that I never spent enough time figuring out how versatile I could get on it. But now I appreciate it. And now I try more than ever to try to work with what I have. And it's funny you say that too, because when we were playing live the other night, for one of the first times, I mean, I monitors are rare that you hear good monitors, but the guy was cranking my guitar through my monitor and it sounded fucking killer. And I'm like, okay, my sound is okay. But most of the time I'm like, God, it sounds, I don't know. I can't, cause my amp's pointing at my legs. Right. And I can't really hear it, but I know it's a good amp and I know I've got good ingredients, but that was kind of a nice little reminder that, hey, you're getting good sounds out of this rig.
A good example of like less is more is I've been like archiving a bunch of old recordings that I've been doing over the years. And the further I go back, the better the shit sounds. And I'm serious. I mean, I was using like an old Radio Shack PZM mic and just like plugging into a board into my computer, and that stuff sounds way better. And I look at my rig now and I've got like a Focusrite interface and, these compressors and preamps and all this stuff. And I'm like, my shit was so much better because I just knew how to use it. Yeah. Even like the 4-track stuff that I did, it was like I just knew how to use it. Now I'm just like throwing shit at it, like, oh, this is a good preamp. This will make my stuff sound much better. And it does not all because I'm not familiar with it. It's bullshit. For me, it's bullshit, and I'm gonna rock that for the rest of the ride out. I'm just gonna focus on what I have.
And I love that. And that's what it's about. Is like learn how to use what you got, man, because that's the key. Learn how to get the most out of what you have, and that's going to serve you well. And like we talked about too, I mean, in terms of trends, like now more than ever, guitar players have a plethora of shit at their disposal for pretty decent prices, man. Like you can get a good Fender guitar for a decent price. You can get any you want for a decent price.
That was, I was going to mention, is as far as trends is like, we're definitely on the upswing. I mean, the trend for starter guitars back in the day, they were fucking shit. I mean, they were nothing like. We are so blessed with the the entry level guitar market right now. The price of admission to be a guitar player, I mean, $200 you can probably get a good enough Fender style guitar to get started. $200 in like 1982 bought you like crap.
I know.
Like, absolute crap. I mean, even at the $300 mark, you're still looking at something that's kind of
Yeah. I think that, yeah, I mean, I think it's super cool actually. And I also, that the cool thing is, I think like Fender has reissued a bunch of the cool, cheaper guitars. I mean, now they're probably more expensive than maybe they were back then, but maybe also not, because like you were saying, you can get a good, new guitar for a reasonable price, and you could get a whole, and they sell packages now too, right? You could get a little package of a guitar, an amp, and whatever for a decent price, and you can start playing guitar on good stuff that, like, if I remember too, like cheap guitars when you and I were coming up, it was just impossible to make them playable.
Yeah.
The action was shit, like
horrible, nuts. Like the thing that determines how well the guitar plays is just like shit, just slapped on there, sticky plastic crap.
Yeah.
And let's talk about the trend that we've been sold since the dawn of guitars, like how solid state is going to take over tubes. And it definitely has for a lot of people. And, some people are, it doesn't matter as much, but the mid 80s, everybody was pretty much saying, tubes are on their way out. Look where we're headed, just step into the future. And it's just not, I mean, tubes just won't die, and hopefully they'll be around for a long time. Yeah. And then that brings to mind the era of the rack mounted systems. I remember when that was really big. Everyone was getting rid of their stacks, and they were getting like the preamp and power amp, and then their whole like Bradshaw rigs. And I think people like find something in these trends, and they kind of stick. I bet you there's still people. I know for a fact there's still people using preamp and a power amp kind of rig to play.
Yeah.
And just kind of jumping around, there's the whole like modeling trend, which some people have just like found the modeling thing and they're like, I'm staying here. This is great. It gives me all these sounds. Mm-hmm. But it's so funny, but I kind of pay attention to these trends. And it seems like every year they're saying, finally, the technology is there. You know what I mean? It's like, here it is. This version of this is the technology that is there. And then there's other people saying, no, it's not there yet. So, I mean, if you find it and you like it, good for you. I'm going to stick with tubes.
Exactly. Well, it's funny. Well, I think it's cool that tubes are still a thing. That was the thing too, is tubes became scarce, and now they've become less scarce. And so people can get tubes, decent tubes. By and large, they're, the older tubes were better and they last longer. That's why they're expensive, blah, blah, blah. But yeah, I dig seeing that too, that people, there's something about that tube sound, that saturation, that everything that is still attractive to guitar players. And in spite of, like you're saying, all the different ups and downs and people signaling the end of tubes with solid state and all that other crap. So I dig it that people still appreciate the tube sound. I do for sure. And also, like, what I've seen too. Yeah. When you mentioned the rack thing, I vividly remember that whole trend. And I was watching some Adrian Belew videos lately, and he still uses some rack mounted shit. But
really,
like, most of the stuff that, when those guys use that stuff, it's really just for convenience, because when they tour, because it's so easy for them to cart that shit around. But yeah, well, that's funny, Adrian Belew. Yeah,
that was the one I was just reading. The Adrian.
That's awesome, man.
January 1984 Guitar Player magazine with Adrian Belew on the cover.
Oh my God!
I don't know what he was playing here. I just read his too, but I didn't really see. He was playing these heavily modified Mustangs with whammy bars. It looks like he has a Ford or a Kahler.
Yeah.
On that.
He's playing, anyway, because I was watching some, because I went down the rabbit hole of he's a great guitar player, but this is a sidetrack. But yeah, I mean, I think, whatever floats your boat, do it, man. I have a friend has one of those little Quilter solid state amps, and it sounds really cool, actually. So I think in some ways that technology has come a long way, and it's better in some ways than it was. But for you and me, I mean, there's nothing that beats a cool little tube amp that is working on all cylinders. It's like it's just cool and it sounds great. It's warm.
For me, it just depends. I mean, some of that's, I hear people all the time that sound great.
Yeah.
And I'll plug into their rigs and I won't feel, I mean, it's me, I have to be plugged into something before I really know. I mean,
Yeah.
So a lot of these things, they sound good. And that's another thing. And this is definitely a trend. And I think it's a trend that's grown exponentially since like the 2000s, is it almost seems to me like things need to sound better in a bedroom than they do, in an actual live situation. It's very important, the make or break situation for like a company making pedals or guitar amps or something like that. It has to sound good. All the shit that we got when we started out was designed to be played at concert level. Like, take the MXR Distortion Plus or something like that. Take it and plug it into your little amp at home. It sounds like shit, really. I mean, you can get some cool sounds out of it, right? I mean, that company would not fly today because it's got to sound good in the bedroom. You know what I mean? It's got to sound good. So, I mean, and I kind of like that old stuff. I mean, that made, for me, as far as like deciding on pedals and setup, it made it so much easier because I'm like, well, I love all these records right here, right? And what were they using? Oh, they were using this shit. I'll use that shit, and then I won't have to think about it anymore because I know that it sounds good. But, and I don't mind some quirks and shit like that. I mean, we've touched upon all these things like true bypass and all these like fads and, concepts that people subscribe to and they evolve over time. I mean, first of all, I don't know, maybe 10 years ago, if you didn't have true bypass, it was like, you were just like stupid. Your tone is just shit. You know what I mean? And then there's people that came along, well, actually scientifically, a buffer, having a buffer might be better. And I don't know. I love when science gets involved because we said, so much of this stuff was like marketing generated. So anytime there's any science behind anything, that's great. But then again, you start to reach a point of overthinking where it's not about music anymore. It's about just geeking out. In some ways, I guess I don't give a shit about the science of it. It's just plug in and play. But that's the great thing about guitar culture now is you can be as involved as you want to be. You can waste as much time as you want to, waste as much money as you want to. So, yeah.
Well, yeah, and I think you raised the proliferation of guitars and gear and all of this other shit. I think that you're right. There is this weird bedroom guitar culture too, where it has to sound killer in my bedroom. That's a whole thing. I mean, that's a whole thing unto itself.
Let's talk for a moment about string gauges through the years, because that fad kind of waxes and wanes. When we started out, for me anyways, I remember actually buying and using 7-gauge strings. 7-gauge strings, yep. And I remember when they first became aware of them, that like the sales clerk was like, yeah, these are thinner than the human hair. I'm like, oh, I got to try those. And I used those for a while, and thin strings were in. I mean, you could bend strings really easy. And I think, a lot of people stuck with them too. But I recall like in the 90s, guitar magazines heavily pushing the idea that, thicker strings equals more tone.
Yeah.
And I kind of bought into that for a while. And I think I went up to as high as 11s. I couldn't go any further on like a Fender.
Mm-hmm.
And they didn't give me any more tone. They gave me less tone because it was harder to bend. Couldn't like do vibrato as easily. So it's like you're losing some of that. I played with a fatter sound with lighter strings. I went back down to 10s.
Yeah.
And I don't know, it's a trade-off. But yes, and it's kind of seems strange that someone would push the idea that just going up like a gauge, their idea was that you're hitting the amp with more signal. So which is a good thing. And that's why, overdrive pedals can make your amp sound really great. You just give it a nice fat signal. But going from like a 9 to 11 or a 10 to 11, I don't think that's going to quite do it enough to make that kind of a difference.
Yeah.
And like I say, the difference in how less fun it is to play.
Oh my gosh.
You have good tone when it's fun to play, I think.
Exactly.
When you feel it on the instrument. And plus, for me, one thing I've learned after years of owning more guitars than I really should have is guitars will tell you what strings they like. You know what I mean? They just feel. I mean, I have different strings on all my guitars. I mean, primarily Gibsons are 10s and Fenders now are 9s, but there's differences, and I can tell if I'm fighting the instrument or if it sounds weird, it's like it's to try a different set of strings.
Yeah, and that's so fun. Yeah, I went down that rabbit hole too because trying the heavier strings and shit. But god damn it was painful. I couldn't bend them. Yeah, exactly. And so but to your point that you just made, it's like try different gauge strings on each guitar because it's going to be different. Like I can put, and again, I think we're lucky that we are on the other side of this evolution in terms of string gauge. I mean, I read, reading articles about Robbie Robertson having to buy banjo strings that were lighter than guitar strings so he could bend the goddamn things.
Right.
Back in the old days, they had, very few gauges of strings, and that's what you had, so you had to get creative. Now, like you turned me on to 9.5s, which on some of the guitars is fucking perfect, man.
A 9 3/4 I'm waiting for. That would be just great.
Or, what people used to do too, or still do, is like, take the gauge, the upper strings of a certain pack of gauge strings and then use heavy bottoms or, now, I mean, it's crazy now how much we have available to us as guitar players that
we are snowflakes. Guitar players are snowflakes. Everything is not good enough. I don't get a guitar from the factory that's right for me because I'm a unique individual and I need this. And the first thing I'm going to do when I get this guitar, this is going to yank the pickups and put all this stuff in there, change all the hardware, do all that. I can't believe we didn't mention the brass age.
Oh, dude.
The brass age was huge. I remember that so well. And I remember drooling over I remember I got a Vantage, a Japanese Vantage Avenger guitar, and I was so stoked because it had a brass nut, like brass bridge and brass saddles, and I'm like, oh man, this is so much tone, and all the replacement parts, like everything. I mean, Fender was making like brass knobs for Stratocasters. That is like, that kind of parallels the audio, like woo guys, like, let me give me the $6,000 speaker cables or stuff like that. It's just, these knobs will just totally take your tone to the next level.
Yeah. I remember the brass phase vividly. Yeah. Brass nuts all over the place. And, I don't know if I ever had a guitar with a brass nut.
I did, I had a Ibanez Iceman, and they like totally rode right down the middle of the trend because it was half brass, half bone. It was
they couldn't
it was really cool. That was a great guitar. That was a really well-made guitar. But
I love those guitars.
And Yamahas, those beautiful Yamaha SG or SBG in this country guitars had huge brass sustain blocks in the wood under the bridge. And that was one where they were really pushing. Those guitars are so heavy, and they were built to be heavy.
Oh my God.
And we've gotten so picky. You'll see people talking about like, that guitar has, a 3-piece body, or a 4-piece body, or maybe even more, and back then the most expensive handcrafted guitars were just like laminated everywhere. It's like, 6-piece necks, all these bodies with like, maple inlaid through neck with, 4 pieces of mahogany and some ebony. And it was just like, it wasn't a thing back then,
No.
And I remember reading a review of a Gibson guitar, and the reviewer, this was been from the 70s, and the reviewer was mentioning multi-pieced body. And the dude at Gibson said, well, we'll use, 1 to 3 pieces of wood if it's good wood and it sounds good. So, I mean, and that to me is reasonable. You know what I mean?
Totally.
If it sounds good, it is good. Now it's like, that neck, that's a 3-piece neck. No, man, that's not, you're losing tone there. Or, it's a 3-piece body. But, I don't know.
Well, there are people who piss all over that philosophy too and say it's the pickups and the strings. It doesn't matter whether it's wood or aluminum or whatever the fuck it is. It's like,
it's the guitar. And I don't know.
It's an electric guitar. Yeah.
Guitar in the hands. And I don't know how many times, and we all know that. We know. I mean, someone will be talking about tone and someone will say it's in the fingers. And we know that.
Yeah.
We know that. But we just love chasing this shit.
I know that's part of that's you and I talk about it a lot, but it is part of the fun, and we're steeped in that because we grew up doing it ourselves. I mean, I took guitars apart, and I mean to this day, I mean I've got Lawler pickups in some of my guitars and shit like that, and so it's a fun part of the experience. Our only caveat is, hey, if you've got a vintage guitar, try not to fuck it up, because we've done that and it's not cool, but otherwise, knock yourself out,
It's fun, but sometimes I do like kind of roll my eyes at some stuff. When the latest YouTube video shows definitive proof, it's the pickups or it's the strings. It's where some guy is playing like a guitar and then he starts taking pieces away and he's playing the guitar. It's like, yeah, okay, you got these strings stretched across this workbench. Now, why don't you bring that to the club and see how it sounds? It's it's just, thank you for your generous time, but it's kind of a waste of time because it's like, it's the guitar. Find a guitar you like that sounds good and feels good and just go with it. I mean, that's what I tell myself. And here I am with a rack full of like 7 electric guitars right now. And it's,
Do I dare get you started on the clip-on tuner trend?
Oh yeah. Tuner trends. That's an interesting one because
let's talk about
we caught again. I mean, we sound like we're old boomers, but we're Gen X. And as such, we were privy to a lot of, it's like, the technology. We were there before with the Atari 2600, all the way up until the modern computer. So we got to see it all, which is great. And it's the same with guitar technology, because I do remember when the first quartz tuners became available, and they were a big deal. I mean, if you look at these old advertisements for tuners, they were these huge things like the Peterson strobe tuner, which is great. And there were also some really funky ones that were trying to be more affordable, that were just like these boxes that you push a button, there's a light that lights up, and just really awkward. And I remember the first tuner, and I think you said have a similar story. Our band, we pitched in, or we took some show money, and we got our first quartz tuner. And before every show, we'd be huddled around, past the tuner, and everybody would tune. And that was a huge step forward. It's like, man, we are so in tune. But us being at that point in time, I mean, I feel really confident you or I could go up on stage and tune a guitar without a tuner and be exactly in tune with the band.
Yeah.
I mean, I've done it before. I've done it recently before, where it's just like not dicking around. I brought a board that didn't have a tuner on it, so I just used my ear. But yeah, the tuner was, and we'll see, I kind of think the clip-on tuner is going to be here to stay. But when I first saw it, I'm like, oh, that's a novelty. That's a fanny pack for guitar. People love them.
I know.
I would love to just take Photoshop and go through all these iconic guitar photos of like Jimmy Page with his dragon hands.
Put a clip-on tuner.
And put a clip-on tuner on those guitars. Joe Perry with his black Les Paul Custom with a clip-on tuner on it.
Yeah.
Yes.
Well, it's funny when you mentioned the onset of the tuner. It was a ritual. I have these vivid memories of us in dark clubs, like all huddled in a booth, waiting to tune our instrument. Yeah. So it's like, once I got done tuning mine, I'd give it to the bass player. He'd tune his bass. And it was, to me, it's kind of cool. Like there was this, it was before stomp box tuners. And exactly. We did the same thing. We saved up money, or somebody bought a tuner, and then we all used it before the show, and we're cool, ready to go. Let's do it. And,
it's like Pearl Jam 10 album cover there with the tuner.
Yeah.
Everybody gather around. Here we go.
Exactly.
High fives.
It's funny, yeah, because I vividly remember that. It was cool. It was kind of this, every gig, it was a ritual. Okay, let's all tune up.
Shit, now that I think of it, I remember this in the 90s very clearly, working down at Emerald City Guitars. The Japanese pedal company, Arion, came up with the first on-the-floor pedal tuner, and they were a cheap pedal company, so it was all plastic. The battery cover popped off, and you never saw it again. But every musician in town wanted one of those. We were constantly ordering those. They were really cheap. And then Boss, in their infinite wisdom, came up with the TU series of floor pedals, and then just kind of blew them out of the water because it was Boss and it was made, durable. But they were if I'm not mistaken, I think they were the first company to put it in a compact pedal form with the big lights on it. The Arion company.
Yeah. Well, I remember too, we had a Conn strobe tuner at one time too that
Those are great.
we
There's tubes. So the early ones are tube. You can make
oh,
them
they
with
were
your hand.
awesome. I loved that thing, and they were accurate as hell too. And so that was I think that was we graduated to that after that. Like you said, the Korg tune, which was those are great tuners too. Those little bricks that you still have one, I think. But yeah, the Conn was cool too, and we'd all share that. But yeah, it was there's something. But now exactly, I mean, you can every person with an instrument that can be tuned has their own stomp box. But it's funny to think about that trend before that, or and before tuners in general, you had to just huddle around each other and either with a pitch pipe or whatever it was, and all get in tune. But yeah, that's
The Wild West it was back then.
I love it, man.
Yeah.
Well, that was awesome, dude. I mean, we covered quite a few trends, and I'm sure there are many more that we didn't cover, but maybe some people will chime in and we can
Part two.
chew on that one. Yeah. But that was great. As always, thanks for listening, everyone. Chris and I are going to try to get back on the horse and do this more frequently. It's fun, man. The last couple conversations have been really fun. So catch us on Spotify, on Apple Podcasts, wherever you dig your podcasts. I think we're there. Check out our website, chrisandricktalkguitars.com. And maybe we'll try to come up with some new merch this year too. And because I kind of worked up a new logo, so maybe we'll do that.
Oh, sweet.
Yeah. You got anything else to say, pal?
We should reach out to a Chinese manufacturing company to make a guitar.
We should. We should.
Talk guitar. A really big, bulky, sticky plastic nut on it, like sharp fret ends.
Super heavy.
$79. Yeah, super heavy.
All right. Maybe we'll try to do that. All right. Until next time.
Bye.
Bye.